Welcome to the Great Reboot. I'm Tori Ryden. Straight from the headlines, Clark County Jail releases nearly 200 inmates due to COVID-19. Clark County is in Vancouver, Washington. Butler County Jail releases hundreds of inmates to ease crowding for coronavirus. Butler County is in Cincinnati. New York State and local officials are seeking the release of nearly 1,500 inmates. Health experts have explained through the public health viewpoint that decreasing density of people is key to slowing the spread of the novel coronavirus, and prisons are dense. My guest, Margo Walsh, started Maine Works in 2010. It's an innovative employment company with a social mission to dignify the experience for people who face real barriers to workforce reentry, including people recovering from substance use disorder and people with felony convictions. Maine Works provides jobs in the fields of construction, carpentry, masonry, roadwork, bridges, demolition, landscaping, and much more. And Margo, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us here on The Great Reboot.
Thank you, Tori. As always, it's a pleasure to see you. I'm delighted to share any thoughts that I might have at this time.
Margo, what folks who are new to Maine Works need to know is that the normal routine for Maine Works begins around a ring of fire, and it's a circle of fire, and it's folks who are going to be working that day. It's a beautiful 6 a.m. circle, a beautiful kind of fellowship ring. Why don't you describe that a little bit and about why it's so important to start the day off that way?
Well, Tori, thank you so much. What you described in that lovely introduction, thank you so much, by the way, is that everybody who comes to work at Maine Works is inherently disassociated from any type of stable home life, any type of stable community, and really in their infancy and trying to get their life back on track. And in many cases, a life on track for the first time, because in this opioid pandemic and associated incarceration of people with drug-related offenses, the urgency and onset has been amplified by the young age at which a lot of people start experimenting with any kind of drugs these days. And a lot of that I've seen a direct association just tangentially related to early use of psychological interventive drugs for young people. So, and that's a whole other story. But in general, everyone comes to Maine Works where they're just starting their lives out in many cases for the first time. And so a group to gather in the morning at 6 a.m. is an opportunity to come together quite literally, physically, and also to be accountable, literally. And we use that as kind of a clearing opportunity to make sure we also can account for who's available and who's looking good and on their game and ready to go out for full day work. And the other part of it that's really important to me is that there's an opportunity for people to meet and greet. And it's been really difficult that we don't do that every day now with COVID-19, which has just been unbelievably impactful on our business.
So it has to just be so difficult. And I want to just also kind of point out that you're a for-profit, which is great, because what that means is that you are literally working, these people are working for you, and you are the link to,
Yes.
construction companies and landscaping companies and bridge builders and all that. And you have such a good reputation of providing these high quality workers who no one else was really gambling on or taking a risk on or putting their faith in.
So thank you. Thanks, Tori. I will say that our construction industry clients, which have been so helpful in bringing these guys on, expect that level of engagement, so we're hiring people who have demonstrated that they can actually show up and work a full 8-hour day at least. So they have to be physically capable and emotionally ready for that kind of impact. We also have some relatively starter jobs that people could try out for a day here and a day there. But importantly, the idea of being the employer is very different than the industry standard for people who are that level of in early transition. Those are the most easily exploited people in the workforce because they are otherwise completely insecure. So a lot of day labor staffing companies grew up in the idea of, we'll just take these guys who are otherwise really hard up, and then the construction companies could have used them, which is exactly how this happened, to do the jobs that no one else wanted to do. And so my emphasis across the board is that everybody that works at Maine Works is fully employed and treated with dignity, just as I would want my co-workers to be treated. So it's kind of taken an idea, which you suggested, of these are people that would have normally been outside or not engaged, and turning that upside down and saying, okay, I'm going to start a company where in order to work at my company, you have to be a convicted felon or a recovering drug addict. So that's kind of how this social impact work has started. And I'm very optimistic that in the aftermath of this pandemic, that we can adhere to some of those principles of turning something that sounded one way and just sort of interrupting that and bringing it out as the opposite. So just challenging every assumption socially that we've made to just invigorate a whole new way forward. So that might be a big aspiration, but I'm hoping to see that.
And it will continue. Here is I want to also fill in a couple of things, because I have been at the morning fire, which I absolutely love. I think folks who are not familiar with Maine Works also need to know that through your philanthropy side, you also provide boots and coats and gloves and everything that they're going to need to be comfortable and safe on the at the work site, and also that when they come in at 6 a.m. and they're shoulder to shoulder with one another, when we're not doing our social distancing of 6 feet, there is that kind of not reliance on one another, but they're showing up for themselves, but also for one another.
Each other.
And there is no judging.
No.
That's what I thought that was absolutely, beautiful when I've been there. There's no judging.
Well, thank you, Tori. We love when you come. It's really delightful. And a lot of guests do come to see what goes on there. And I feel that it is the great equalizer because no matter, and I'm also in recovery. So since 1997, I've been in continual recovery. And I feel like my moment of great awakening was when I was living this sort of very high impact life in New York City, and then ended up in a rehab facility in Portland, Maine, which was, against everything in my playbook that I would ever end up in a rehab facility. But the paradox is that when you are at that level of feeling just so demoralized and broken, that your peer group from that time becomes the most important standard for interaction that you carry forward. And so for these guys who are shoulder to shoulder, quite literally, they have now just been starting to learn about the importance of that kind of relationship, which is based on absolute truth, no posturing, no division, no social mores that push us apart, but actually just the unifying social standard of acceptance and generosity. And I feel like that is the key to Maine Works in the morning. And I think of that in this pandemic as a key to our way forward.
I couldn't agree more. I'm wondering, with this pandemic, with COVID-19, what now? They can't stand shoulder to shoulder next to one another. Yeah. So what's happening now with Maine Works, and
I think it's sort of akin to parents being at home with their kids and having all of this sort of intensive group family, interaction. Many of the guys that work at Maine Works had been living continually in sober houses or group homes of some kind. And so they've now been pushed back into those trenches and learning a new way forward, working as a community. We do remain open. And again, we received essential business status through the state of Maine, which was because we follow the construction industry. And so a lot of our guys are still working, and we check in with them all the time. So we actually check in with every employee at least once a day. Are you feeling safe? Do you recognize that your employment with us is completely at your will? You can be on unemployment tomorrow. The grace of this, the state response and the federal response is that everyone is eligible for unemployment right now in this urgent time frame, so that no one is unnecessarily exposed. But the construction industry has their own standard for operation, including rigorous social distancing and hygiene protocols that have been set up and established at all of our client sites. And we only choose clients that would adhere to the highest standard anyway. So I feel like the guys who are still working, the last men standing, frankly, are really out there on the front lines and are doing so knowing full well that they could be eligible for, unemployment and to go home and stay safe with their own people. Many of the guys that are still working don't have families, so they're not putting anyone else at risk by going home to that setting.
Doesn't it give them, Margo, kind of a sense of worth, though, and that they're really doing something for the community by staying on? I mean, do you think that that's part of what's fueling their desire to
Yeah.
just keep going to the job site?
Yep, and we want to be careful with that because there have been a lot of guys who would have loved to be at work still, but they just can't because it wasn't physically practical within their job site. Most of our guys that are working now are working outside, physically, literally outside. Like on a day like today where it's raining in sheets, it's really not the greatest thing. But I think typically from a morale standpoint, yes. And then the other thing that we're trying to do is invigorate a sense of community engagement and finding community volunteer opportunities for our guys that can happen practically at a distance with respect to the virus response. But we're hoping to get involved with distribution of food and other things. But again, managing volunteerism sounds really great in the aspirational side of it, but at the same time, practically speaking, it's just difficult to make sure that everyone is as safe as possible. And if we've been asked to stay home, that's the mandate. So we don't want to breach that shamelessly. We want to make sure that what we're doing is actually in line with standards that are being set forth by, the Good Food Shepherd, the Shepherd Food Bank, or whatever.
Right. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are trying to find ways that they can help through
Yes.
either,
Yep.
Unloading boxes off of trucks and for food pantries. Margo, my mind has been, at least once a day, my mind goes to, I worry about people who are in recovery during this time. It has to be so difficult. You're hearing all these people saying, oh, let's have a 5 o'clock, everybody get on and have a cocktail together. You're seeing that everywhere. And I'm just wondering, how hard is this for people in recovery with heightened anxiety and the just not knowing what's happening with this COVID-19 and just trying to figure out better coping skills?
So the vulnerability that's being expressed by humanity is amplified when you are furthermore distanced from your old life of drug addiction or alcoholism or whatever that might have been, especially since that was your coping mechanism. So the tragedy of that is that people who are now equally sort of dealing with all of those emotional distance issues, they no longer have their comfort zone. They don't have the opportunity to drink a few glasses of wine, which, oh my God, I've not had a drink in a long, long time, 20 something years. But it's that default to saying, wow, now I can see why there's such an appeal. Everybody wants to have that washed over feeling, so it's really dangerous. And I think that another part of this is really dangerous is that the ubiquity of CBD treatment, everyone's smoking pot, or, there's all of these methods for people to escape are going to become they're a crutch and a very difficult place, actually. So I think we have to be really careful about keeping together and keeping, I just got off a 5-way conference call just to keep our office together and feel like everyone has a place and we can see each other, because there's a lot of isolation happening. And I think there will be some good that will come from it. But I also think that, we really miss social interaction, and it's amplified in addiction and recovery.
It's got to be. I worry about that, and I wonder about that. And coming out of this, what are we going to see? That's the question, and none of us knows the answer to that.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Well, I think there's a few things that we need to look at in this crisis, and I would love to. This is when you want to go back to your Depression era survivors and the people who survived 9/11. That were actually in the heat of that. What would they have wanted to see? And I've been asking this of my staff, here's this opportunity. It's an inflection point to sort of look at all of the processes. How do we do things? What's expected of everybody? And how can we do it better? And how can we do it? And how can we look at and challenge assumptions and really just look at the way things are being done and say, if we could have started this all over again, what would it look like? And I think that, maybe detox and sober houses and that kind of protocol for people in recovery, or jail itself, should be totally re-examined. They're closing the youth center for this exact reason. And that was previous to the COVID-19 outbreak. But just to say that doesn't work anymore. We're dealing with a lot of employment law issues related to drug testing, for example, that were written in the 1970s. And no one's had an opportunity to say categorically, stop, reboot, look at everything critically and say, how do we move forward? And so I think that there'll be a lot of consulting opportunities for people that can sort of say, how do we challenge assumptions and the way things have been done? That's, to me, the opportunity. And that, to me, I keep thinking, I can't stop thinking about how could we be of value and of service in this moment. So if you want to know what keeps me up at night, it's more about that than about, oh, this is so bad.
Right. And I think that's what makes you such an excellent leader. And I don't mean to make you blush or anything like that, but that's what separates leaders from people who are going to be, allowing anxiety to take over. And you have to keep that at bay, and you've got to keep moving forward. It's almost like, remember Martin Sheen on West Wing, what's next?
What's next?
And right. What's next? I read an interesting, I just wanted to share with you, it was just something as I was looking into kind of prison population stats. And I was surprised that the actual measurement of space per prisoner, the last time that was even reviewed was in the mid-90s. And it seems to me a lot of things need to be overhauled on that front too, because, I think that prison populations have waxed and waned, and some areas have higher populations, but, they're looking at releasing potentially some kind of scary prisoners in New York City just to help keep the COVID-19 at bay inside prisons. But that's another story. But it is interesting that it will require an overhaul on many fronts.
So I have a couple of friends who actually spent quite a bit of time in solitary confinement in prison, 12-year sentences, 15-year sentences. I'm thinking of two individuals particularly who have grown incredibly as people because of that experience. We are lamenting being locked in. I mean, I think I have 3,000 square feet around me. It's just a horrible statistic. But as opposed to a teensy little cell where you're just sitting for days and years. And so what does that bring out in people? And how do we really dredge for the psychic impact of that kind of isolation? How do we really make a study of this? Now, I just saw that someone in the legislature, actually in the Democratic Convergence the other day, said something like, we need to go back and really review what happened here and how did this all come to be, which is, again, it's a necessary process. But I think that the most important thing we can do right now is look at how have people behaved in isolation and in the past, and what are some of the most important strategic opportunities that this whole thing is putting up in front of us? What's the message? So look at Greta Thunberg with her, school strike for the climate. And now all of a sudden you're seeing the climate completely taking a huge breath despite our pandemic. That is actually, I'm just giving me goosebumps. That is compelling.
As a direct result of the pandemic. I mean, the ozone layer and all of that, self-repairing. When you were talking about isolation, not to get away from Greta, but I just wanted to pick up on Nelson Mandela. I mean, look at all that he achieved in his isolation, and all of the wisdom and all of the great writings, and look at that leadership.
I actually have not read in years the lessons from a Birmingham prison, Martin Luther King, and I think that would be something for us to all revisit, rather than scrolling on Facebook. get out
Right.
some of the really pivotal writings and read them and sort of understand what the historic context was, of course, but what's the message in there? Nelson Mandela is a perfect example of someone who, you know, just blossomed in many ways, or who had so much more to give because of that experience.
Right.
Which
Right.
is,
He took what others could not survive potentially,
yeah,
and he turned it into a grace. And
yeah,
so he was
yeah,
able to kind of harness that energy that way. I think, what I love is I'm seeing a lot of book clubs popping up. You and I should have a book club, Margo. I think that would be great. Let's start one. But I think that there are opportunities this way. And so we're isolated, and yet we have now these tools in which, through which we can communicate, which is really
yeah,
pretty breathtaking,
yes,
actually, to
yeah,
think had this happened 100 years ago, it wouldn't be. But it is the hard part about all of this is that it is cataclysmic, and it is the first global type of
yeah,
pandemic. I mean, it is gripping every single corner of this earth.
yeah,
So it is an all in type of situation.
yeah, yeah. I feel that we are, the world is so small now. My son just returned from Bali, Indonesia, and it was really, there was the big question of should I stay or should I go, because he was actually on the crest of the virus. Actually, had just started to pass the Southeast Asia, and but he just, there was a sense of being home that I'm really glad that he had. And so he's back now, thankfully, because of the State Department directive, which said, you better come home now, or else you might not be able to get back. And so I just think that the fear, I can't believe how this is just coming in waves, and the waves bring fear, and that we are already an anxious population. There's been so much, going on. So I'm really busy. We stay extremely busy. We're dealing with the day-to-day of operations and not letting, on a macro level, there's so much to talk about, but on a micro level, we're just busy. And we feel that I think the best way forward is to um, aspire to becoming the best organization that we can once this starts to soften. And Maine Works as a company, you mentioned that we're a for-profit company. Accidentally, I started this company in 2010 by myself, and I feel like part of our initiative had to do with helping people that were really unlikely. So I think that the outcome of this is to look for the unlikely and follow that. That's what I would say.
Do you have, that's one of your pointers. I'm going to ask you for two others. What else might you say to people kind of from your vantage point? And I also want people to check you out on, your website. So why don't you give that information first, and then that'll give you a couple seconds to think about some other.
Okay, thanks, Tori. So MaineWorks can be found at mainworks.us. And we are a social employment company that's thriving in this time. And we're really excited because we started out in a recession, more or less, after 2008. And we are looking now at a profound challenge to the job market coming back to life in a very different way after this, medical crisis. And we're hoping that to hold on and to be having treated employees well during this time is the pivotal key that I would offer to any other companies. And then also to the extent that you can just reallocate your resources so that you can take care of people, absolutely, especially if they're on unemployment. That's not a panacea. That's just enough to put your finger in the dike kind of thing. But at the same time, how do you help people by making them whole if they've been displaced with at none of their own because of the pandemic? So I think that the way that companies conduct themselves in this time will be indicative of how they will be received on the other side. So really look at your operations and really look at the morality of what you do, I think.
And keep communicating. Don't
Totally.
stop. Don't
Yes.
ghost.
Yep. And
Right.
keep in touch with people and let them know that they're loved, that they're like part of your family. It really is. We just had a guy that was converted to the city of Portland to work for the city of Portland now, a full-time employee. And when he showed up at Maine Works at that circle, shoulder to shoulder, and I'll end with this, about 10 months ago, he didn't even know where his birth certificate was. And he was a basket case trying to find, how do I get my birth certificate from my hometown in Pennsylvania? And so I became so frustrated because I have very little patience for people who can't follow a simple process, but Maine Works is full of people who struggle with that kind of thing. And
It's a lot of anxiety,
kind
right?
of anxiety. So he just turned it all around and showed up every single day and kept doing his thing and kept putting these little pieces together, getting his license back. I mean, that's Herculean when you don't know where your passport is or your birth certificate is. So now he's been converted effective Monday to the city of Portland. And that is a job with a pension and they're open. His department, Public Works, will be open. They're considered essential first responders, right? Trash collection, whatever. And so just to see someone go from completely broken and disassociated shoulder to shoulder with peers and then moving through that based on his own hard work and endurance, but that he made some really good friends along the way. So I think that's the most important part.
Margo Walsh, learning again and again and again how to pivot, shift, reboot. You've done it over and over again, and you're doing it again, and it's great because you're doing it on behalf of so many people, individuals, but also for companies, and you're helping to keep them alive as they kind of face an unknown future as well. I just wish you all the best, Margo, and Maine Works, and all the best to you. Just keep up the great work and keep up that what's next attitude.
Thank you, Tori. Same to you. And it's with deep appreciation that I was able to join you today. Thank you.